Welcome to this edition of African Perspective. I'm really excited to have all of you back. I know it's been a long time. And of course, we're going to talk about some of the biggest talking points from around the African continent over the past week or the past few months, actually. And here's what's coming up. Robert Mugabe passes on. How will he be remembered? Xenophobia in South Africa. What are the root causes of this violence? Cameroonian football legend Samuel Eto'O hangs up his boots. Is he the greatest African footballer of all time? So about 2 weeks ago, we received the news that the former president of the Republic of Zimbabwe, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, passed away at the age of 95 in Singapore. And this news has been received with mixed feelings across the continent, across the world. And right now, I just want to try and reflect on his legacy and understand why there's been such a mixed reaction with regard to his legacy. But unfortunately, I think Mugabe will be remembered mostly for being the poster boy for what represents a bad African dictator, especially during his tenure during the early 2000s when the Zimbabwean economy completely collapsed. I remember even during that time there was a running joke in school when I was in high school or in middle school really. There was a running joke that you'd bet with a couple of your friends and say, I'll bet you $1 million if you do this. I'll give you this amount of money. Or if I lose the bet, I'll give you X amount of money. And at the end of the day, you say, no, I'll give you 1 million Zimbabwean dollars. So that was the running joke. But of course, this was no joke for Zimbabweans on the ground. It was a terrible time and still is a terrible time. Zimbabweans are still reeling from the economic strife from that period. And of course, in late 2017, we saw Mugabe deposed in a peaceful coup in Zimbabwe by the military. And you should have seen the elation from the elation and the happiness from the Zimbabwean people. But it was not always like this, for Mugabe. Mugabe was initially thought as a liberation hero, an African hero, a Pan-Africanist in the 1980s, as a man, as an individual, and a very intelligent, brilliant man with all credentials. He had about 7 degrees. He had lived, I think, in the UK and in Ghana as well. That's where he met his first wife as well. Very cultured, erudite individual who was passionate about African identity, Pan-Africanism, or at least it looked like it. But, you wonder why someone with all these credentials, someone with all these accolades would eventually see Zimbabwe to its downfall. And even before the early 2000s, during the economic collapse, Zimbabwe, before especially the 90s, was considered as a hub of agriculture and education. According to UNESCO, Zimbabwe has the highest literacy rate in Africa, with 89%, staggering 89% literacy rate, which is extremely high by even not only African standards but by global standards generally. Even on a personal level, I know some Zimbabweans on a personal level who are super smart. I know this is, a small sample size, and it's not really the most scientific method of kind of measuring a whole country by making value judgment on individuals. But really, I do remember even a lot of East Africans from our region, Kenyans, Tanzanians, Ugandans used to send their kids to Zimbabwe for school. And Zimbabwe was a place with a lot of potential, and unfortunately it fizzled out. And the debate has been, with Mugabe. Mugabe tried in some ways to solve the land question, the land distribution question, which is a big question across the continent, in terms of the many colonial settlers, um, in different parts of the continent that still have their land, and the indigenous people sometimes are not having the land or the wealth, even after independence. And in Kenya, we have a similar issue in terms of land redistribution. Unfortunately, the land redistribution ended up going to a number of small elites where you have one family owning 10% of Kenya's land, but that's another story for another day. But essentially, in the early 2000s, Mugabe embarked on a project of taking land back from the white settlers that were based in Zimbabwe. And this caused uproar, really. And it saw economic sanctions from across the world. Of course, the debate around Mugabe's legacy is, particularly centered around the land question and land redistribution in Zimbabwe, redistributing the land from, white settlers back to the Zimbabweans. And of course, this is going to be a running debate, and history will judge, people differently. But of course, you have on the one hand, what you could call Pan-Africanists and Africanists who say, Mugabe, we support him. His Pan-Africanist ideals and trying to get land back to the people is something that, we support. And I think also the main premise of reappropriating wealth is a good idea, but sometimes in practice it could be very problematic, as I've mentioned before. Sometimes, even in this land reappropriation or wealth redistribution, we find that it's usually the elites or the political elite that take most of the land. And that has been the case at times, even now in Zimbabwe, and I think also in places like in my home country, Kenya. But you also have, on the other hand, people who talk about Mugabe's legacy beyond the land question and economic question. Unfortunately, we cannot turn a blind eye to some of the atrocities and some of the, strife that, Mugabe caused, or, the hurt that Mugabe caused on the Zimbabwean people. When I think about, even in the early 1980s, through the mid 1980s actually, as well, where we had the Gukarahundi, massacre, so to say, where the two different factions, where the ruling party, ZANU-PF, that's Mugabe's party, is, comprised mainly of a group called the Shona, an ethnic group called the Shona, and there was also a rival party that was composed mainly of Ndebeles. And during this time of, these rival factions fighting for power, a lot of Ndebeles lost their lives, and people put that some in the thousands, actually, and some argue that it was a genocide. And, that's one of the things that is leveled against Mugabe. And also, when you look at his legacy, and especially in the 2000s, during the period of hyperinflation and the economic downfall, he oppressed any type of dissidents or any type of opposition in Zimbabwe, and this was not good. People were tortured, people were beaten. A lot of Zimbabweans had to flee Zimbabwe. So unfortunately, Mugabe's legacy, unfortunately, in history will be regarded as somewhat tainted, despite his best efforts to, solve the land questions and give it back to Africans, and also his ideals of Pan-Africanism. But unfortunately, we cannot turn a blind eye to some of the things that he did and perpetrated on the Zimbabwean people. But for me, there's a silver lining in all of this, and despite all the issues that Zimbabwe is facing, and even till today, Zimbabwe still struggles to recover from the economic, downfall of the early 2000s. I think we're now in the hundreds of thousands of Zimbabweans who have fled the country to neighboring South Africa and to other places around the world. The silver lining is, of course, the quality of the human capital that Zimbabwe has, I think. Zimbabwe, we already talked about it, with the highest literacy rate in Africa. I really think when everything stabilizes politically, watch this space for Zimbabwe, because I'm really, really excited for, the next few years for Zimbabwe, despite having a President Mnangagwa, who served under Mugabe, who was part and parcel of this regime, of this oppressive regime. But nonetheless, I am hopeful for the Zimbabwean people, who deserve a lot more than they're getting. And may God bless Zimbabwe, and may Robert Mugabe rest in peace. We move on to neighboring South Africa, where it has been a tough couple of weeks for this country. And of course, I think you may have seen this on the news and media outlets around the world, the pictures of xenophobia, essentially violence against foreign nationals in South Africa. But this is particularly different because we're talking about violence particularly against foreign African nationals. Some people describe it as Afrophobia. And before I go on to the details of what happened and what I think about the situation, I also have to mention the big issue as well that has gripped the nation about gender-based violence. We had the terrible news of a young university college student at the University of Cape Town who lost her life when she went to a post office and she was raped and killed subsequently. And the man who perpetrated this heinous act was actually non-remorseful. Actually, it was terrible to see, actually, and has opened a huge debate about gender-based violence, not only in South Africa but also here in Kenya and across the continent. Do our women, our ladies, feel safe in different spaces? And it's a very unfortunate situation at the moment, and that's definitely something we'll be talking about in coming episodes. But back on the xenophobia issue. So the past few weeks, you've seen violence against foreign African nationals, looting of stores of foreign African nationals by South Africans. And this may come as a shock to many people because, when you talk about the apartheid struggle, when you talk about Pan-Africanism and how, the solidarity in terms of getting South Africa liberated from the chains of apartheid, how many African countries were in support of its people, and also hosted a lot of South Africans. It kind of you kind of ask yourself, why is this happening even with this history? And unfortunately, this is not the first time that xenophobic attacks against foreign African nationals has happened. Sometimes we see, now with the advent of social media, we see more clips, or perhaps more we have more information about what's happening in South Africa, and perhaps it's even a bit sensationalized. There's been a lot of fake news around it, but in reality this is nothing new. We saw this also in 2008, where it was actually very bad, where a number of people lost their lives as well. But it's been widely reported and it's been covered, but I think people are kind of missing the real point, or when you try to ask the question, what is the root cause of this xenophobic attacks and this hatred against foreign African nationals, it has to go a lot deeper. When we talk about the root causes of xenophobic attacks in South Africa, we have to look at the economic situation of South Africa. And South Africa is perhaps one of the highest in terms of economic inequality around the world, and in Africa it is the highest. And you wonder why. I think I saw an interesting statistic that both Nigeria and South Africa, which are Africa's largest economies, actually have the highest inequality in Africa. So I don't know what that means about economic growth and the size of economies. I don't know what to make of that, and I think that's something that could be studied. I came across an interesting article recently by an author called Suraya Dado that is on The Elephant, which is a wonderful website that has a collection of some of the best articles and opinion pieces on African affairs. You should follow it. I'll leave the link below. And they argue that this anti-African violence is as a result of the lack of inclusion, the economic inequality that is taking place in South Africa at the moment. And I think this is something that has to be dealt with in terms of this could be potentially a ticking time bomb, where you have a disproportionate amount of wealth that is held by the elites. And I wouldn't even say elite, but it's also a very kind of racial dynamic to it, where you have white South Africans who still own the bulk of the wealth in South Africa. Recently I sat down with two South Africans who are having the same debate, and the debate was around the land issue and land redistribution in South Africa. And on the one hand, we had one white South African, it was a black South African. And it was an interesting debate, but very heated, and you could see the emotion on both of them. And on the one hand, the white South African said that, in terms of land redistribution, it has to be done in a legal and, kind of expedient manner in accordance with the law. But the argument by my black South African friend, was that, it has to be, it cannot be done legally, so to say, or they cannot be compensated because South Africans were stripped of that land illegally anyway in the first place. And it's an interesting debate, and I think it's one that South Africa has to deal with. And I feel that, economic inequality around the world, and not only in Africa but around the world, is a danger to democracy, is a danger in terms of keeping peace. So it's a difficult situation in South Africa right now, but I'm still hopeful. I'm still hopeful that they'll find a resolution to it. When you talk about, neighboring Zimbabwe and how the land redistribution kind of expedition kind of went south, I hope that they can learn from these kind of experiences and try and bring some type of middle ground to the situation. But unfortunately, with regard to the Afrophobia and the xenophobic attacks, I don't think it will be the last of it that we see because of the economic situation. But I really do hope we do find some type of resolution. I personally, I can't really speak to the South African situation because I don't have a mastery of it. And I think it would be interesting to have a conversation with some more South Africans and to hear what you guys have to say in terms of what are potential solutions to this issue. So as you can see, I am donning the shirt, the national team shirt of Cameroon, and this is in honor of the great, the legendary footballer, Samuel Fils Eto'O, who about 2 weeks ago announced his retirement from football. What a player this man was. I remember my first memories of watching football, I think it was the 2000 Africa Cup of Nations. And this Cameroon team was just absolutely, they were beasts really. You had Jeremy in midfield, you had Lauren in defense, an Arsenal player, you had Patrick Mboma, legendary striker as well, and who can forget the guy with the dreads, Rigobert Song, the captain. But the young man who was on the scene at that time was Samuel Eto'O, who was in his early 20s and taking the world by storm. This was a kid who was plying his trade initially with Real Madrid and then eventually went to Mallorca at that time. But I just remember him, he was just so dynamic, he was just such a brilliant finisher. And I think, to be honest, if we were to have a debate about the best African footballers of all time, I think it would feature as maybe top 2 or top 3. It would be a toss-up between him and George Weah. And yes, you may say George Weah won the Ballon d'Or, but I think Samuel Eto'O fell in a generation where you had guys like Ronaldinho. Messi was a kid, but Messi was still coming up at the time. You had Ronaldinho, Kaká. I know Fabio Cannavaro won a Ballon d'Or at that time. But really, even people like Thierry Henry, the legendary Arsenal player, did not win a Ballon d'Or. But Samuel Eto'O, a 4 or 5-time African Footballer of the Year, had an incredible goal scoring record with Barcelona, won Champions Leagues with Real Madrid, by the way. He was at Real Madrid at 17. A lot of people don't know that. I also didn't know that till I was doing my research. Came across him in a Real Madrid shirt. I was like, wow. But he was in the youth ranks but never got to play for them, and then eventually moved to Mallorca and then moved on to Barcelona and went on to Inter Milan, where he won the Champions League. But when you just look at his goal scoring record, especially for Barcelona, you have 139 goals in 199 matches. That is ridiculous. And he was part of a team with the dynamic trio of Thierry Henry on one side and also Messi, a young Messi on the other side, under Pep Guardiola, and also under Frank Rijkaard. He was just an absolute beast. So we want to remember Samuel Eto'O. And he's also a wonderful player, off the pitch, in terms of what he's done, in terms of, making an academy in Cameroon. Actually, if you didn't know, Andre Onana, the Ajax goalkeeper, was actually part of Samuel Eto'o's academy in Cameroon and was scouted by Barcelona, where he was taken by the Barcelona U team and eventually bought by Ajax. But Samuel Eto'o as well, he's always present for the Cameroonian national team, football, in terms of supporting them. And I hope he continues to play a role in kind of developing grassroots football, not only in Cameroon, but across the continent. But man, Samuel Eto'o, man, if you watched him play, I mean, these young kids don't really know. They see Mane, they see Salah, but I think perhaps in my humble view, Samuel Eto'o is the greatest African footballer of all time. So we pay homage to him. I hope he has a good life in retirement and after football. So good luck to Samuel Eto'o. Thank you so much for tuning in to African Perspectives this week. So before we leave, we have a quick Twitter poll for you. You'll find it on below. And the question we have for you this week is Samuel Eto'o the greatest African footballer of all time? I definitely think so. Of course, this is a massive debate. You have, players like George Weah from Liberia, Ballon d'Or winner, Nwankwo Kanu from Nigeria, JJ Okocha. You can think of Elhadji Diouf from Senegal. You can think of Mohamed Aboutrika from Egypt. He's won the Africa Cup of Nations many times. You can even think of current players, Mohamed Salah from Egypt, Sadio Mane. You can't forget Yaya Toure and Didier Drogba from Ivory Coast, Benny McCarthy from South Africa. The list is endless. But I definitely think Samuel Eto'o is the best. But please pitch in your views and see if you agree with me. I would really be interested to see who you think is the greatest African footballer of all time. But for me, there's no one else like Samuel Eto'o, really. What a player he was. So thank you so much for tuning in. See you next time.